you guys is simply this. How many of you use a GPS device of some sort, whether it's on your cell phone, whether it's on your dashboard in your car, or whether it's a handheld device that you use to go walking through the wilderness? How many of you guys, by show of hand, are at least familiar with using a GPS device of some sort? Isn't it amazing how dependent we've become on these things to get us around in daily life? I know that I'm one that I will not go on a trip unless I know where I'm going, and I know exactly how to get there, and I know all the ins and outs of where to get. But have you ever stopped and asked yourself how crazy it is how much we rely on these instruments that can be faulty? Have you ever wondered what makes these things so reliable in the first place? If you do a little research online and in some other areas, you're going to find that they're reliable for the simple fact that, number one, a lot of forethought went into it in the design and in the implementation, but number two, they are reliable because somebody takes the time to recalibrate them as necessary. For instance, with the earthquake that's recently happened in Japan, we know that our GPS system not only depends on satellites, but it also depends on the ground stations. Well, some of the ground stations in Japan shifted by as much as 20 feet, some might even say as much as 40 feet, depending on where they were at in relation to the earthquake. Now, we need people to go back and recalibrate, not only for shifts in the crust, not only for shifts in daylight savings time, but for general shifts that happen with the satellites themselves. Without that recalibration, we're going to find ourselves becoming lost on our journey. Now, I'm going to argue tonight, very simply, that not only is that true when it comes to moving our physical bodies around the earth, it is also true moving our spiritual bodies on our journey in our relationship with Christ. You see, Paul understood this. As he's writing in Philippians, he understood that the church at Philippi, while they weren't wildly off tangent, they needed to recalibrate their life and refocus, recenter on Christ. Paul wrote Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, in order to exhort the church at Philippi to continue in faithful obedience by doing three things: working out their salvation, doing everything without grumbling or arguing, and rejoicing in all things. Tonight, I want to share with you three characteristics of faithful obedience that should describe your walk with Christ. And so with that out of the way, let's take a look at what Paul says in these verses. In verse 12, he says, "So then, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now even more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is working in you, enabling you both to will and to act for his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world. Hold firmly the message of life. Then I can boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run in vain or labor for nothing. But even if I am poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. In the same way, you also should rejoice and share your joy with me." The very first characteristic that Paul points out in this passage of our faithful obedience is that faithful obedience requires us to work out our salvation. Now, I want you to notice what is missing in this to totally appreciate the gravity of what he's saying. If I'm teaching somebody about how to be obedient, probably the first thing I'm going to mention are the rules. This is what you have to do to be obedient. Paul starts in a totally different place. He says, you need to work out your salvation. In other words, he starts with Christ. He not only says you need to work out your salvation, he says you need to do it with fear and trembling. And I'm going to talk about why in just a second. We need to understand that our obedience isn't about checking off a list of do this, don't do that, and do these other things. It's about letting Christ work himself out in your life. It's about, like the Incredible Hulk from the Avengers, letting the true nature actually reveal itself in your life. You can't hide it if it is actually in your heart, and to do so, honestly, is futile. It's about like, if you've ever seen Men in Black, it's about like the giant cockroach bug wearing the Edgar suit. It just don't look right, okay? We need to let Christ work himself out in our life. Now, we do it with fear and trembling because it is God who works in us. He is the one who gives us both the desire and the ability, and who does the work. We need to realize that we're not alone in this. God gives us strength. He is the one who does it. Now, some people will stop right here and struggle with the idea, well, how do I work this, and how does God do his thing? It really doesn't matter. There is a perfect synergy between us working alongside of God's grace and being responsible for our part while he does what only he can do. So the very first requirement, the very first characteristic of faithful obedience is that it requires us to work out our salvation. Now, how does this apply in our lives? It means that in every area, we're letting Christ rule. Whether it's dealing with our children as they do their homework, whether it's dealing with our spouse when we come home and things aren't quite as the way we would have liked to have been after a long day of work. It even means doing our homework to the best of our abilities. It means letting Christ rule in even those dark areas that you don't want anybody to know about. So not only should he work himself out in our lives, the next characteristic of faithful obedience is that it requires to do all things without grumbling and arguing. If you look at verses 14, 15, and 16, the imagery that Paul paints here is of the Israelites in the wilderness. If you've read through Exodus at any point in time, you know they failed miserably over and over and over. And nearly every single time a part of this was their attitude towards Christ, towards God. Their speaking became ugly as they turned their eyes away from God, put their eyes on their situation. And as they did that, they began to grumble. Moses received that. Now, we see from that their grumbling wasn't just against Moses. It was ultimately against God. Paul says that we're to do this, to be doing everything without grumbling and arguing, so that we can be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation. We're to be and practice what has already been declared of us by virtue of the fact that we are adopted as God's children. When we do this, we're going to shine like stars. You can't hide it. I don't know how many of you have ever been on the Parkway, but when you are up on the Parkway in western North Carolina, there is no light to hide the plethora of stars that are in the heavens. When we do everything without grumbling, when we cease the bad attitudes, when we stop complaining, people see a difference, and they know. They recognize it. We do this, we see in verse 16, by holding firmly the message of life, by continuing to hold on to that gospel that Paul keeps calling us back to. Paul goes on to say, then I will be able to boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run in vain or labor for nothing. Now, Paul's not being selfish here. What he is saying is simply, I want to see fruit. And don't we all want to see fruit? Don't we want to see the results of the labor that God has done through us in the lives of other people? Now, I would ask you, how well do you do this? How well do you operate without grumbling, without complaining, without questioning? Probably one of the most dangerous things about coming to seminary is developing a cynical attitude, developing an overly critical attitude towards others who are in the ministry. I know because I'm one. I can't tell you how long it took me to get past that in the church that I'm in. I had to get to know the men who were leading in that church before I could get past the overly ugliness in my heart over how they were doing things in the church. Let me move on. Not only are we to be faithfully obedient by working out our salvation, not only are we to be faithfully obedient by living in unity, which is really the picture that Paul has here of us not grumbling or questioning or being ugly, we are also to rejoice in all things. Verse 17 through 18, even if I'm poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and on the service of your faith, Paul is using the imagery here of sacrifice. He understood who he was in this process. He understood because of who God is, because of his calling, because of his humility, that he was playing second fiddle to what God was doing in the church of Philippi. You see, Paul wanted his life to count. He wanted Christ to be everything. And in so doing, he recognized that he needed to serve Christ fully. He was able to do this because of his humility. He was able to do this because of his desire to serve to the utmost. And he was able to do this because of his love and desire to fulfill his purpose. How much does joy truly reign in your life? When you serve Christ, do you complain? Do you look only for the negative things? Do you focus on what you're having to give up in order to be in school, in order to find a job, in order to do what God has called you to do? Or do you look at what you have to gain? Now, I would move towards asking you guys this simple question. What good does it do to know that your navigational tools need calibration if you're not willing to do anything about it? Would you travel by yourself with navigational tools in such a sorry state? How about this? Would you take others with you on the journey with your navigational tools in such a state? I think all of us in here would answer no. If we recognize the folly of traveling like this physically, then why on earth are we so willing to do it spiritually? Paul makes it very clear that the three characteristics of faithful obedience, working out your salvation, living in unity, rejoicing in all things. The choice that we have now is to revisit the gospel, to let it permeate our life like Paul expected it for the Philippians. If there's a course correction that you have in life that you need to make, what is keeping you from that today?